Okay, I hope I'm audible to all my students who are attending this particular lecture for the intermediate macroeconomics course. In this particular lecture, I'm going to start with a very important module within the intermediate macroeconomics course. This is the ISPCMR model, the three equation model and the macroeconomic policy. Now, in my lectures on fiscal and monetary policy before, students have learned how the government uses the fiscal policy, and we have also learned how the central bank designs its monetary policy to achieve a given target rate of inflation. Now, we are going to learn more about the monetary policy rule along with the combination of the IS curve as well as the Phillips curve. Now, the IS curve and the Phillips curve are concepts which I have covered up before in my intermediate macroeconomics course. So, how a combination of IS curve, Phillips curve, and the monetary policy rule set by the central bank will be used to achieve a given target rate of inflation and output in the economy is something which we are going to learn in these particular lectures. Okay, so in today's lecture, I'm going to introduce to all students the topic ISPCMR model, the three equation macroeconomic policy. Okay. This lecture is particularly recommended for all those students who have intermediate macroeconomics as one of your core courses or even elective courses at undergrad level. Okay. So if you have taken up economics at undergrad level, you will be having this particular topic in the intermediate macroeconomics course. Okay, so let's quickly start with discussing the three equation macroeconomic policy in this particular lecture. So let's start with the discussion of this lecture. So I am just writing the main heading for completeness. We are looking at the ISPCMR model, which is the three equation model. The three equation model. Okay, and I'm also writing the name of the book I'm following for reference. So the book I'm following for reference is Macroeconomics, Institutions, Macroeconomics, Institutions, Instability, and the Financial System, and the Financial System by Carlin, by Wendy Carlin, and David Soskis. Okay, this is one of the very important books we prefer to follow for monetary policy rules, for wage setting, price setting equations, for demand and supply side. We usually follow this as a recommended book. Okay, so in today's lecture, I am just introducing to all students. So it's going to be a very theoretical lecture. We are going to have the math and the models coming up in further lectures, but this is just a theoretical lecture. All my students who are attending this lecture are requested to make notes. Okay, these notes are going to be very helpful in summarizing the whole topic, and you can safely rely on these notes when you are also preparing for your exams. Okay, so let's write the heading introduction to the three equation model. Introduction to the three equation model. Okay, so let's look at one of the very important characteristics, first of all, of the modern monetary policy. The modern monetary policies adopted by the central banks today are very forward looking. So central banks decide monetary policies today based on expectations. So I can write that a crucial characteristic A crucial characteristic of a modern monetary policy regime, crucial characteristic of a modern monetary policy regime is that the central bank is forward looking. When I say forward looking, it means it designs the monetary policy based on inflation in the future. Okay, so I can write that the central bank forecasts inflation. The central bank forecasts inflation by analyzing what is going on in the economy, what is going on in the economy, and the central bank, I can say, it must take into account the lags between changes in the interest rates, it uses for its monetary policy. And the impact of that rate on the economic activity. Okay, so what I'm trying to explain to all students is, first of all, the first important point to understand is that when you talk about the modern monetary policy, it is forward looking. It is based on how the economy is going to be in the future. When central banks have to decide today about the monetary policy, they look at the macroeconomic parameters in the future. Okay, so the central bank is going to forecast inflation by analyzing what is currently going on in the economy. So the central bank gets to forecast what is going to be the inflation expected in the future, next year. And it must take into account the lags between the changes in the interest rates it uses for the monetary policy and their impact on the economic activity. Usually, we have learned this before also in our macroeconomics course. We have talked about lags. There is usually a time lag or a gap between when the central bank changes the interest rates and when these change in interest rates have an impact on economic activity. So, for example, when the central banks reduce the interest rates today, investment and output don't immediately increase. It takes time. When interest rates fall, cost of borrowing of the firms reduces, they borrow more for investment purposes, aggregate demand goes up. But there is a time lag between when the interest rates fall and when the aggregate demand goes up. Everything is not happening very quickly. It takes time. There's a time lag. So central banks have to take into account the fact that whatever policy they are going to implement, it will take some time for that policy to come into action. So usually there are time lags between what the central bank does and the impact of that on the economy. Okay, so this is what the paragraph was explaining it. Okay, so now I can erase the initial portion off and I can continue on the top with further explanation. I can write that it takes time before the monetary policy has a full impact on inflation and the real economy. Okay, so monetary policy is not impacting inflation immediately. It takes time for the monetary policy to have its complete impact on inflation and therefore the real economic activity. Okay, so I can further write that monetary policy is therefore guided by forecasts for economic development. It is therefore guided by the forecasts for economic development. Okay, so now let us see what are the three important things the central bank should know. When the central bank is going to decide about the monetary policy, what are the three questions the central bank has to answer before designing its monetary policy? So I am erasing all this off now. I hope students are making notes along with me. This lecture is very introductory and doesn't contain much of math or models, but it's going to come in the next set of lectures. So I can write, when three things are known, which are point one, what the central bank is trying to achieve. What the central bank is trying to achieve. That's the first thing the central bank should know. What is the objective? What does it want to achieve? How it thinks, how the central bank thinks, about the constraints, it faces arising from the behavior of the private sector, The central bank also has to think that when it's going to design its monetary policy, what are the constraints it's going to face from the private sector? Remember, the private sector also has a significant impact on the policies taken by the central bank. The central bank has to take into account the fact that how the private sector will respond, or what are the constraints it is going to face from the behavior of the private sector when it changes its interest rates and so on. The third question central bank needs to ask is how the central bank implements its policy. So what is going to be the design of the monetary policy? How will it be implemented? So first thing, the central bank decides what it is trying to achieve, the objective. Is the central bank targeting inflation or output or employment? What is the objective of the central bank? Second thing, it's going to take into account the constraints it is going to face from the behavior of the private sector. The central bank needs to think about that. The third thing, how the central bank, once you have decided the target, how you're going to implement your policy. These are three things the central bank should know. So I can say this information will provide a skeletal model. This information will provide a skeletal model enabling an analysis of how the bank will respond to a variety of shocks in the economy. how the bank will respond to a variety of shocks in the economy. When you have answered these three questions, okay, it's going to provide you with a model which is going to help you analyze how to counter the shocks in the economy or how to respond to the shocks in the economy. Okay, so I can write now, if I erase the initial portion of, I can continue with the explanation on the top. I can write that these responses to shocks, can be summarized in the form of, they can be summarized in the form of a simple monetary policy rule. They can be summarized in the form of a simple monetary policy rule. This rule sits at the heart of a three equation model, which we are going to analyze in the coming lectures. It sits at the heart of a three equation model, which is produced by adding, I can erase this off and I can continue forward with the explanation, which is produced by adding the monetary policy rule, monetary rule curve, monetary rule also called the MR. Remember, this is not marginal revenue, please. It is monetary rule. In our lectures, when I'm going to use MR, it will denote monetary rule, not marginal revenue. Okay, so this rule sits at the heart of the three equation model. The three equation model will contain the monetary rule curve. It is going to contain IS curve from the demand side. IS curve from the demand side. And it is going to contain the LM curve, the Phillips curve. Let me correct myself. It is going to contain the Phillips curve, short form PC, from the supply side. Students who are attending this particular lecture, we have talked about IS curve before in our modules on Keynesian economy and ISLM. We have talked about Phillips curve also before in our lectures on inflation, unemployment, and expectations. So only the monetary rule is something which is going to be new for all students. Otherwise, IS and Phillips curve is something students must have already covered from my initial modules before. Okay, so that means the monetary policy rule is going to contain these three equations: monetary rule curve, IS curve, and the Phillips. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the depth of those three questions which the central bank has to ask. Okay, so first of all, let's look at what is the central bank trying to achieve. So now I'm erasing all this. Okay, so we now turn to each of the three questions. We now turn to each of the three questions to pin down how the monetary policy is conducted, within the three equation framework. Okay, first one is, what is the central bank trying to achieve? What is the central bank trying to achieve? What are the objectives? So I can write, it is assumed, let me write this clearly. It is assumed that the central bank's aim, the central bank's aim is to use the monetary policy, to stabilize the economy. Objective is to use the monetary policy to stabilize the economy. Which means, what does stabilization mean? Which means keeping the economy close to the equilibrium output. Remember, we have discussed that every economy has some equilibrium or full potential level of output. I can call this also as the full potential level of output. So the objective of the central bank is to keep the economy close to the full potential or the equilibrium level of output, and keeping the inflation close to its targeted rate. Every economy has a given target rate of inflation. For example, if you talk about the UK economy has a target rate of inflation of generally around 2%. And different economies have a different target rate of inflation. So the central bank decides that, okay, given this economy, this is the target rate of inflation, and this is the equilibrium level of output or the full potential level of output that can be produced in this economy. So now what should be the monetary policy in order to make sure that the economy is always close to its full potential level of output and the inflation is also meeting the targeted level? Okay, so I can further write that the central bank may be penalized. The central bank may be penalized if it fails to meet its inflation target. If it fails to meet its inflation target. I can write, for example, in UK, target inflation is around 2%. Target inflation is around 2%. Okay, that means if the central bank is not able to meet this, if the inflation is above or below 2%, okay, then the central bank has to explain. It's going to be penalized for deviating from its inflation target. Okay, so this answers the first question. In simple terms, in layman terms, there is no math we are doing today. So the math is going to come in the coming lecture. This is a very descriptive lecture where we are learning that when the central bank plans to design its monetary policy, it has to answer these questions. And when we talk about what the central bank is trying to achieve, generally for every economy, central bank is trying to achieve stability. The macroeconomic parameters should be stable. It should not be that output is very high or very low, inflation is very high or very low. That is not recommended. Every central bank aims to achieve inflation equal to its target level and output close to its equilibrium or full potential level of output. Okay, so the central bank might lose its reputation if it's not able to achieve its target. So I can write that, I can erase the initial portion off and I can write this on the top, that the closer the economy is to having output at equilibrium, the closer the economy is to having the output at equilibrium, and inflation on its target, lower will be the reputational cost of the bank. Lower will be the reputational cost of the bank. Okay, so hoping students have understood this. Now let us see what are the forces which are going to prevent the central bank from achieving the target, which comes usually from the private sector. Okay, so I can now answer, if I erase all this off now, I can now answer the second question. What forces prevent the central bank? What are the forces which prevent the central bank from achieving its target? Forces which prevent the central bank from achieving its target. Okay, so the central banks need to assess these forces in order to make sure that stabilization is achieved. So I can write this, that this is essential. This is essential information in order to assess the prospects of economic stabilization. In order to assess the prospects of economic stabilization. The economy is affected. The economy is affected by shocks to demand and supply. The economy is affected by the shocks to demand and supply, which in turn affect output and inflation. Which in turn affect output and inflation. Okay, let's take an example. Suppose, for example, there is an unexpected boom. So I can write an unforeseen boom, for example, which takes output above the equilibrium will increase inflation above the target, because when the boom happens, inflation will go up. When boom happens, demand goes up. Demand goes up, inflation will go up. So will increase inflation above the target as the position of the workers in the labor market strengthens. As the position of the workers in the labor market strengthens. That means if there is an unexpected or an unforeseen boom in the economy, it is going to cause output to rise. When output rises, employment rises. When employment rises, the bargaining power of the workers improve. When the bargaining power of the workers improve, they start asking for higher wages. When wage costs go up, firms increase prices, which causes inflation in the economy. So this is a shock. Okay, the central bank needs to analyze these shocks before designing its monetary policy. Okay, so this aspect I can write, and this aspect comes from the Phillips curve. So I can now write this aspect of the wage behavior. This aspect of the wage behavior is captured in the Phillips curve. It is captured in the Phillips curve. Okay. Okay. So this improvement in the position of the workers is captured by the wage behavior in the Phillips curve. Remember, when we were deriving the Phillips curve, we used to talk about the bargaining power of the workers. When there's an economic boom, it increases the bargaining power of the workers. They start asking for higher wages, higher cost of production, higher prices, and therefore inflation. Okay, so you can clearly see how the monetary policy, how the central banks will design their monetary policy depends upon the Phillips curve behavior. That is why we are taking Phillips curve into account in our lectures. So I can write that if I erase this particular portion off to save some space, I can write here at the bottom that the central bank has to take this behavior into account, has to take this behavior into account okay, the central bank has to take this particular behavior into account, including the persistence of inflation, including the persistence of inflation. And then there's lack of space, I can erase the initial portion off and I can continue with the explanation on the top. The central bank has to take this behavior into account, including the persistence of inflation, when it designs its response to the boom in the economy. We started our example with an unforeseen boom, if our students remember. We started with an unforeseen boom. So when there's an unforeseen boom in the economy or an unexpected boom in the economy, it causes output to go above the equilibrium, inflation goes way above its target. As a result, what happens? Why is this happening? Because of the Phillips curve behavior. When output goes above equilibrium, employment goes up. When firms produce more output, they hire more workers. Bargaining power of the workers go up. They start asking for higher wages, and then it leads to finally higher prices and inflation. That means the central bank needs to take into account this Phillips curve behavior, including the fact that there's going to be persistent inflation when it designs its monetary policy rule in response to the boom in the. Okay, so this was the second question which we have answered. The third question now. So for that, I'm erasing the bottom paragraph completely. The third point, let me erase this also now. The third question, how does the central bank translate its objectives into monetary policy? How does the central bank translate its objectives into the monetary policy? Answer is very simple. It uses a monetary policy rule. The central banks use a monetary policy rule. Okay. This can be represented. This can be represented in the same diagram as the Phillips curve. We are going to draw diagrams in the next lecture. It can be represented in the same diagram as the Phillips curve. That is a diagram with output, on the horizontal axis Output on the horizontal axis and inflation on the vertical axis. Inflation on the vertical axis. So what are we doing? We are to make the monetary policy curve or the monetary rule curve. We are going to plot output on the horizontal axis and inflation on the vertical axis. This will demonstrate how the central bank will choose its preferred policy response given the constraint it faces from the behavior of wage and price setters captured by a particular Phillips curve. Remember, a Phillips curve captures the wage setting and the price setting decisions. We have covered wage setting and price setting relations before in our intermediate macroeconomics course. Okay, so the central bank, how is the central bank going to translate its objectives into designing a monetary policy? It is going to use a monetary policy rule. The monetary policy rule will be drawn in the output inflation space, where output will be measured on the horizontal axis, inflation will be measured on the vertical axis. It is going to demonstrate how the central bank is going to choose its preferred policy response, given that the constraint it's going to face from the wage setters and the price setters captured by a given Phillips curve. So the monetary policy rule will be a response of the central bank to the constraints it is going to face from the wage and the price setters determined by one particular Phillips curve. Remember, all this will become even more clear in the coming lectures when we take examples. Okay, so I can now sum up this particular lecture. If I erase all this off, I can sum up that to implement its preferred policy response, in practice, the central bank diagnoses the shock and its forecast effect on inflation and output. It uses this together with its preferences. For stabilization to estimate the output gap it is trying to achieve. Output gap would be the gap between the actual output and the equilibrium or the full potential level of output. Okay, so I can say that the monetary rule curve or the MR curve, I'm writing it, it's not marginal revenue, it's monetary rule. The monetary rule curve illustrates central bank's response. It is going to illustrate the central bank's response to the shock, like the boom we had looked at a few minutes back. It then uses the relationship. It then uses the relationship between interest rate and output. It then uses the relationship between the interest rate and output in the IS curve. Remember, the IS curve shows relationship between output and interest rate. So it's then going to use the relationship between interest rate and output through the IS curve to implement that choice. Students can think of this as the whole summary of the lecture today. So if the central bank has to implement its preferred policy choice, what monetary policy choice the central bank should use? It is going to first of all diagnose the shock. Is it a positive shock to the economy or a negative shock? And then the central bank is also going to look at the shock on inflation and output in the future. Remember, we started the lecture today with central banks being forward looking. We started our lecture today with assuming that central banks in the current monetary policy rules, in the latest monetary policy rules, are all forward looking. So that means the central bank is going to analyze the shock and its impact on inflation and output in the future. It then is going to use its preferences for stabilization to estimate the output gap. The central bank will estimate how much is the output gap. What is the difference between the actual output in the economy and what the output the central bank is trying to achieve? The equilibrium output the central bank is trying to achieve, how is that, by how much is that far away from the current output level? And the monetary policy rule set by the central bank will be a response to the shock. The central bank is going to use the IS curve, which is the relationship between interest rates and output, to implement its choice or design its monetary policy to combat that shock and make the economy come back to the equilibrium level of output and targeted rate of inflation. Remember, ultimately, the objective of the central bank is to bring the economy back to the equilibrium level of output and the targeted rate of inflation. In order to bring the economy back to the equilibrium output and targeted inflation, the central bank is going to use the monetary policy rule. It will analyze the shock, look at the impacts on inflation and output in the future, use stabilization policies, use the preferred monetary policy to estimate the output gap. The MR curve will actually illustrate how the central bank is going to respond to the shock in order to bring the economy back to the equilibrium output level and the targeted rate of inflation, for which the central bank is going to use the IS. The Phillips curve will be used by the central bank to diagnose the shock. In order to diagnose the shock, the central bank will use the Phillips curve, which will capture the behavior of the wage setters and price setters. To combat the shock, the central bank is going to use the IS. And the monetary policy rule will be used by the central bank to see the output gap and how the economy can be brought back to the equilibrium level of output and the targeted rate of inflation. So this lecture was a very theoretical lecture. It was an introduction to the topic. Okay. So I hope all students attending this lecture have made notes. In the next lecture, I'm going to look at a practical example. We are going to see the central bank's monetary policy. Central bank's monetary policy in response to a consumption boom. In response to a consumption boom. We are going to see how the central bank is going to respond to a consumption. Something I intend to look at in the next lecture. So I stop in this lecture. I hope students have enjoyed this lecture. Any doubts, you can unmute your mic and ask, or you can get in touch with me for doubts on call or WhatsApp, or you can mail me your doubts at divineschoolofeconomics@gmail.com. This is where I stop in this lecture.